They sent me out to the store wearing torn clothes. It wasn't just a casual oversight or a moment of forgetfulness. It was deliberate, calculated. I remember the way my daughter looked at me when she handed me the frayed cardigan, the edges ragged and stained, as if it were a message stitched into every thread. "They'll think you're homeless," she said, voice sharp but somehow distant, as if I were invisible, or worse, a joke. I nodded without protest, the weight of those words heavier than the fabric wrapped around my shoulders. At 78, I had never imagined my own flesh and blood would treat me like a charity case, to be hidden away, a problem to be shuffled off to the corner store instead of the dinner table. The cardigan smelled faintly of old smoke and cheap detergent, and when I looked down at myself in the cracked mirror by the hallway, the truth settled in, like the dust on the windowsill. I was no longer the woman who had raised her children, cooked their meals, wiped their tears, and carried their burdens. I was a ghost in my own home, draped in tattered cloth, sent out to prove some cruel point. The memory of that day stays with me, sharp and biting, like winter's chill crawling into my bones. I live now in a small flat above the train station, where the clatter of trains and the faint smell of oil and iron have become my constant companions, a far cry from the warm kitchen where I once held court as the matriarch of a large family. This place may not be glamorous, but it is mine, and the silence here is sweeter than the hollow echoes of rejection I left behind. My daughter's house, once a place I thought would be my refuge, turned out to be a stage set for humiliation. The room I was given felt less like a home and more like a cage, a narrow space with peeling wallpaper, a single chair, and no photographs that bore my face. The family photos on the mantelpiece belonged only to the new wife and her children, all perfect and poised, their smiles frozen in time, excluding me from their story. When I arrived, my suitcase felt heavier than it should have, filled not just with clothes, but with the weight of invisible boundaries. My presence was tolerated but not welcomed, as if I were a visitor with an expiration date stamped on my back. I wasn't just ignored, I was erased. My daughter's words echoed in my ears every time she told me to stay quiet, to stay out of sight, or when she glanced at me with thinly veiled impatience, as if I were a troublesome relic she wished to hide away from the polished life she curated. The more I stayed, the more I felt myself shrinking, folding inward, trying to become smaller to fit into the narrow space they allotted me. The children barely acknowledged my existence, their eyes flickering with the dismissiveness of youth trained by their mother's example. At the dinner table, I ate in silence, the clatter of silverware masking the absence of conversation. The warmth I once knew was replaced by a coldness that seeped into my skin, a reminder that I was no longer family in the way I had believed. I didn't cry that first week, nor did I shout or demand answers. Instead, I retreated into a quiet despair, wondering how someone you loved could look through you as if you were nothing more than a shadow on the wall. The cardigan I wore to the store, torn and forgotten, became a symbol of everything that had changed. It was a badge of exclusion, a fabric testament to the fact that the woman who had spent a lifetime giving had been reduced to a burden to be disguised and dismissed. The neighbors stared as I walked past, their eyes averted or filled with pity. Some whispered, others pretended not to notice, but I felt their judgments like sharp stones beneath my feet. That day, I walked slower, my steps heavy with the knowledge that the family I had nurtured was no longer mine to hold. In the small hours of the night, when the house grew quiet and the distant hum of the city faded, I lay awake wondering when I had become so invisible. Had it been a gradual erasure, a series of small, unnoticed cuts that bled away my place in the world? Or was it always there, hidden beneath the surface of smiles and promises? The answers eluded me, tangled in years of sacrifices and silences. But one thing was clear: I was no longer seen. I thought back to the days when I was the center of our family's universe, the keeper of traditions and stories, the one who held everyone together with steady hands and an open heart. How easily those roles were stripped away, replaced by a cold indifference that chilled deeper than any winter wind. The cardigan was not just a garment. It was a message, a warning, and a wound all at once. It told me I was forgotten, unwanted, and unworthy of the dignity I had once taken for granted. But it also ignited something inside me, a flicker of defiance that refused to be extinguished. I realized that if I allowed myself to be diminished by their cruelty, I would be truly lost. So I began to watch, to listen, and to remember who I was beneath the torn fabric and fading years. The flat above the train station became my sanctuary, a place where I could reclaim the parts of myself that had been silenced. The sound of trains rushing by was a reminder that life moved forward, relentless and unforgiving, but also full of possibility. I learned to find comfort in the small things: a warm cup of tea in the morning, the notes of a piano drifting up from the girl in the apartment below, the quiet strength that comes from standing alone and unbowed. Though the past still lingered like a shadow, I knew that I had not been erased. I had been hidden, yes, but not defeated. And in that truth lay the beginning of my story's next chapter. It was the moment when I understood that this was no accident, no moment of thoughtlessness, but a deliberate turning away that broke something in me. I had come to my daughter's house, believing in the soft promises she made months before my surgery, those gentle words of care and support, the reassurance that I would be surrounded by family, not sidelined like an old piece of furniture. But the reality that day was colder than any winter morning I had known, and it shattered every expectation I clung to. I had spent the morning resting in the small guest room, the walls closing in around me with their quiet indifference. When she called out to me, it was not with warmth or invitation, but with a clipped, impatient tone that barely masked her frustration. "Mom, I need you to run to the store," she said, glancing briefly at the torn cardigan I had reluctantly donned after finding nothing better in my cramped closet. Her eyes avoided mine as if she were embarrassed by my very presence. "Get some things we need for dinner," she added, her voice tight, almost rehearsed. I hesitated, feeling the sting of humiliation prick at the corners of my throat, but I nodded anyway. There was no point in arguing. She held out a shopping list, folded and creased from frequent handling, a reminder that I was expected to perform the simplest of tasks, but only on her terms. When I stepped outside, the brisk air bit through the thin fabric of my jacket, and the weight of those torn sleeves felt heavier than the groceries I was to carry. The neighbors looked up as I walked past, their faces registering surprise, pity, or perhaps a silent judgment. I imagined their thoughts: an old woman sent out like a beggar, a mother reduced to a shadow. Each step to the store was a journey through the invisible barriers that had been erected around me, walls made not of brick, but of neglect and disdain. At the corner shop, the clerk raised her eyebrows when she saw me. I could feel the gaze of those behind the counter, the whispers that surely followed. The sharp contrast between the neatly dressed young mothers with their polished children and me, in my tattered cardigan, was a quiet accusation, a question without words. How did you fall so far? The groceries were simple: bread, milk, some vegetables, but carrying them back felt like hauling the weight of every slight I had endured. When I returned, my daughter barely looked up from her phone. She took the bags without a thank you, without a glance, and immediately launched into a tirade about the things I had forgotten or bought wrong. It was a cruel game she played. expecting perfection from someone she barely acknowledged, then finding fault when it inevitably failed. The air between us thickened with unspoken resentments and broken promises. That evening, as I sat alone in my room, the loneliness pressed down like a suffocating blanket. The sounds of laughter and conversation filtered through the walls, a reminder that I was no longer part of that circle, no longer the mother or grandmother whose presence had once been a source of warmth and strength. I thought back to earlier days when family dinners were filled with noise and love, when I was the center of attention, the keeper of stories and traditions. Now I was a ghost, tolerated but unwelcome. The catalyst for my journey had not been a single moment of cruelty, but the accumulation of small cutting acts that stripped me of my dignity. The torn cardigan was the outward sign, but the deeper wound was the knowing that I was no longer seen as a person worthy of respect or care. In the days that followed, the pattern became clearer. Requests came with a sharp edge, expectations piled high with no gratitude. I was told when to speak and when to be silent, where to sit and when to leave the room. The little freedoms I had once taken for granted were chipped away until I was left with nothing but the barest bones of existence. The turning point came when my daughter suggested that I consider a nursing home, a place where I could be properly looked after, away from the burdens of family life. The words landed like stones, hard and final. I realized then that I was not being cared for, but discarded, a problem to be managed rather than a loved one to be cherished. The catalyst was not just the torn clothes or the humiliating errands, but the moment I saw the truth behind the smiles and excuses. It was a betrayal so deep that it cut through years of love and sacrifice, leaving a raw wound that would not heal easily. But within that pain, a spark ignited, a flicker of something fierce and unyielding. I knew that if I accepted this treatment, I would lose not only my place in the family, but my sense of self. The betrayal became the beginning of my awakening, the moment when I stopped being the passive victim and started to see the outlines of a path away from the shadow they cast upon me. It was the moment I realized that the life I thought I had was gone, but the life I could still claim was waiting beyond the walls of that house. The catalyst was the breaking of a bond, but it was also the birth of resolve. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world was still and the weight of loneliness was heaviest, I began to plan. I gathered the fragments of my strength, pieced together memories of who I once was, and imagined a future where I was no longer invisible. That day, my daughter sent me out wearing torn clothes to remind me of my place, but I decided that my place was no longer with those who saw me as less than whole. The catalyst had shattered my world, but it had also opened a door I was determined to walk through, no matter where it led. The betrayal that had cut so deep was not the end, but the first step on a new journey, one marked by courage, defiance, and a fierce reclaiming of dignity. And so, with trembling hands and a heart full of quiet fire, I set my feet on the path away from the house that had become a prison and toward the life that was still mine to live. After that day, when my daughter sent me out to the store in torn clothes, a subtle shift began in the way I was treated, a slow and quiet erosion that no one outside the walls of that house would notice, but that I felt in every breath I took and every glance that passed me by without meeting my eyes. It was not a sudden explosion of anger or cruelty. Rather, it was the drip, drip, drip of small humiliations and erasures that wove themselves into the fabric of my daily life until I found myself unraveling. I was no longer a person with a voice, a history, or a place at the table. I was a problem to be managed, an inconvenience to be tolerated in the corners where no one would look too closely. The cardigan, once a sharp symbol of my daughter's dismissal, became a quiet emblem of my diminishing presence. They hid my nicer clothes in the back of the closet, clothes I had carefully saved and cherished over the years, the fabric of memories and dignities stitched into every seam. When I asked for something clean and decent to wear, I was met with sighs or excuses. "Oh, Mom, that's for special occasions," or "You don't need to dress up for the kids." The children were taught to avoid me, their silence around me heavy with the lessons they had been given without words. This woman is not to be engaged with, not to be included in your games or your laughter. Their eyes darted away when I tried to join the conversation, and the youngest would occasionally wrinkle her nose and whisper about "that smell," a cruel phrase I knew was meant for me, but spoken softly enough to sting like poison. At dinner, I sat at the end of the table, not by invitation, but by default, the chair pulled slightly away from the others, as if my presence might unsettle the carefully curated peace of the family. The conversations flowed around me like a river that I could no longer touch. When I tried to speak, my words were met with impatience or gentle admonitions to be quiet. I learned to swallow my thoughts and feelings, to shrink back until my voice was barely a whisper, barely a ripple on the surface of their lives. Money became another battleground, where my autonomy was stripped away, piece by piece. Instead of being given a simple allowance or access to a joint account, I was handed coupons, small change, and store credit that was limited and controlled. Requests for things I needed, medications, toiletries, a warm coat for the winter, were met with delays or outright refusals. The message was clear: you have no right to ask, no right to take. It was as if they had taken a ledger and started to tally up my worth, subtracting with every act of neglect, every glance of disdain, until I was left with nothing but a balance of debts I could never repay. The quiet control extended beyond the tangible to the emotional and psychological realms. I was told repeatedly that I was too loud, too forgetful, too much trouble. The phrase, "You need to calm down," became a mantra that accompanied every attempt I made to express frustration or pain. When I questioned decisions about my care or my living arrangements, I was met with weary sighs and excuses about not wanting to argue or keeping peace in the family. But peace was a lie, a fragile veneer that covered a deeper current of resentment and fear. The children, caught in the middle, repeated what they heard and saw, sometimes cruelly, sometimes out of confusion, and learned helplessness. I witnessed their faces harden, their laughter shrink, and their curiosity about me turn into avoidance. It was a slow, painful lesson in invisibility and rejection that I felt in the marrow of my bones. One of the hardest moments came when the doorbell rang unexpectedly, and instead of a warm greeting, I was met with the cold stare of my daughter's friends or colleagues who had come for a gathering. I stood quietly in the hallway, feeling like an intruder in the only home I had known. They spoke around me, not to me, and the room seemed to shrink with the weight of their unspoken judgment. The conversations turned to careers, vacations, and future plans, words that felt like they belonged to another world, a world from which I was excluded. I found myself retreating more and more into the small room that was mine in name only. The walls, once a refuge, became a prison where memories and loneliness collided. At night, I lay awake listening to the muffled sounds of laughter and music, knowing that I was outside the circle, a forgotten figure in the family portrait. The isolation was not just physical, but existential. I questioned my worth, my place, and the meaning of a life that had been built on decades of sacrifice and love, but now seemed to dissolve into silence and neglect. Despite the growing distance and the coldness that surrounded me, I held onto a fragile thread of hope, a belief that I could find a way back to myself. The small acts of resistance began as whispers inside my mind, quiet refusals to be erased, to be silenced, to be invisible. I started to notice the little things I could still control. The way I arranged my few belongings, the books I read late into the night, the small meals I prepared in secret when no one was watching. These moments were my lifeline, reminders that beneath the layers of hurt and neglect, there was still a woman who deserved respect and dignity. But the first escalation was not just about what they took from me. It was about what they tried to break inside me, the slow stripping away of autonomy, the constant erasure of my presence, and the growing silence that surrounded me were designed to make me smaller, less significant, less real. And yet, in the face of this, a quiet fire began to burn. I found strength in the knowledge that this was not the end of my story, that there was a part of me that refused to be diminished. Each small act of neglect was met with an inner vow to survive, to hold on, to find a way out of the shadows they had cast. I began to observe them more closely, to listen to the patterns of control and dismissal, to understand the unspoken rules that govern my existence in that house. It became clear that their cruelty was not random, but a calculated effort to maintain power and silence. But it also became clear that they had underestimated the quiet resilience that lived inside me. The first escalation was a test, a slow tightening of the noose around my identity, but it was also the beginning of a reckoning. I would not disappear quietly. I would not fade away like a forgotten photograph. The cardigan I wore to the store was a symbol of their attempt to mark me as less, but it also became a reminder of what I refused to become, a shadow without a name. As the days turned into weeks, I began to gather the pieces of my fractured self, to reclaim the small spaces of dignity that remained. I held on to the memory of who I was before the erasure began, and I started to plan how I might reclaim not just my place in the family, but my sense of self. The first escalation was a crucible, a fire that tested my spirit and forged a determination that would carry me forward. Though the path was uncertain and fraught with pain, I knew that I could no longer live in the silence they demanded. I was ready to speak, to act, and to reclaim the life that had been stolen from me, one small step at a time. There was a day when I stumbled upon something unexpected, something that cracked open the suffocating silence and forced me to see the world and myself in a different light. It was the moment when the quiet despair that had settled in my bones began to shift, when the embers of my spirit flickered with a tentative glow of resistance. I had been searching for my lost keys one afternoon, a simple, frustrating task made heavier by the weight of years and neglect. In the tangled mess of my knitting basket, where yarn and memories intertwined, I found an old USB drive, its plastic casing worn and scratched from time. I barely remembered how it got there. I plugged it into the ancient laptop tucked away in the corner of my room, a machine I kept mostly for the comfort of connection to a world beyond these walls. What I saw on the screen surprised me, a video recording, grainy and unsteady, but unmistakably real. There, in the harsh fluorescent light of a pharmacy backroom, was my daughter, laughing with a friend as she slipped bottles and boxes into her bag. Her smile was easy, carefree, unaware that the camera watched. The moment froze in time, a stark contrast to the quiet humiliation I endured daily. She was not just the woman who dismissed me with torn clothes or cold words. She was someone capable of crossing lines, of breaking rules that held others to account. The discovery ignited a fire within me. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt the surge of agency, a sense that I still held power, not just over my own fate, but over the truth. I knew what I had to do, though the path ahead was unclear and fraught with risk. I began to document quietly, gathering evidence with trembling hands, printing still frames, and collecting thoughts that had been buried beneath layers of silence. This act of reclaiming my story was more than just a confrontation with my daughter's wrongdoing. It was a symbolic breaking of the chains that bound me to invisibility and submission. The days that followed were filled with quiet planning and preparation. I found solace in the small acts of control, the decision to speak, to reveal, to stand firm. I reached out cautiously to distant relatives and old friends, testing the waters of support and understanding. The stolen video was no longer just a recording. It became a talisman of my resilience, a reminder that I could still shape my narrative. This shift was not without cost. The weight of betrayal deepened as I grappled with conflicting emotions. Love, anger, fear, and hope tangled into a complicated knot. I questioned the woman I once trusted to care for me, while also confronting the part of myself that had been complicit in silence. The act of breaking the pattern required courage that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. Yet, amidst the uncertainty, I found moments of clarity. The torn cardigan I wore when sent to the store transformed in my mind from a symbol of shame to one of defiance. I began to see myself not as a victim of neglect, but as a woman awakening to her own strength, ready to reclaim the dignity that had been stripped away. The midpoint of my journey was not a dramatic turning point, but a slow and steady rising, a rekindling of purpose and identity that propelled me forward. It was a subtle but profound shift in how I saw myself and the possibilities that still lay ahead. I started to set boundaries, small but firm, asserting my needs and desires with a quiet but unwavering voice. When my daughter suggested that I accept power of attorney, that I relinquish control for my own good, I said no. When the pressure to conform to their narrative grew stronger, I resisted. This was no longer their story to write. It was mine to claim. I began to reach out beyond the walls that had confined me, forging connections with neighbors, local community groups, and even a woman down the street who played the piano every afternoon. These new relationships, fragile and tentative at first, became lifelines that reminded me of my worth and place in the world. The small flat above the train station, once a refuge, became a home filled with the sounds of life and hope. The video, the evidence I held, was not just a tool for confrontation, but a symbol of the truth I refused to let be buried. It marked the beginning of a path toward freedom, a way out of the darkness and into the light of self-possession. This moment was not an end, but a beginning. It was the turning point where I stopped waiting for rescue and started rescuing myself. I was no longer the woman sent out in torn clothes, hidden and dismissed. I was a woman who had found her voice, who could see the cracks in the facade and was ready to step through them into a new life, one shaped not by others' neglect, but by my own resilience and determination. And so, with the old USB drive clutched in my hand and a heart swelling with quiet courage, I stepped onto the path of reclaiming my dignity and rewriting my story. The days after my discovery and quiet awakening were not the calm I had hoped for. Instead, they became a new battleground, a series of mounting pressures that tested every ounce of strength I thought I possessed. My daughter, sensing the shift in my resolve, grew more restless and volatile, as if the cracks I had begun to expose threatened to unravel the careful world she had constructed around herself. The atmosphere at her house grew colder, sharper, more hostile, and I could feel the walls closing in tighter, the noose of control winding ever more tightly around my neck. The gentle dismissals and subtle erasures gave way to more overt threats cloaked in false concern. It began with hushed conversations behind closed doors, sharp glances exchanged when I entered the room, and whispered warnings that carried the weight of ultimatums. "You need more help than we can give," my daughter said one afternoon, her voice a mix of exhaustion and frustration that barely concealed the hard edge beneath. "Maybe it's time to think about a nursing home." The words landed like a hammer blow, final and unforgiving, stripping away any remaining hope of a shared future. It was not just a suggestion, but a declaration of surrender, a way of saying that I was too much trouble, too fragile, too much of a problem to be part of their lives. I looked at her, trying to find in her eyes the daughter I once knew, the one who had held my hand when I was sick, who had laughed at my jokes, who had promised to care for me in my old age. But those eyes were guarded and cold, reflecting a woman burdened by responsibility and bitterness, unwilling or unable to see the mother she was pushing away. The threat of institutionalization was terrifying, but worse was the message it carried, that I was no longer capable of managing my own life, that I needed to be controlled and confined for the convenience of others. Around the same time, the conversations about power of attorney became more frequent and insistent. They framed it as an act of love and protection, a necessary step to ensure my safety and well-being. But beneath the polite words and forced smiles lay an attempt to wrest control from me, to strip away the last vestiges of independence I clung to. The meetings with lawyers, the signing of papers I barely understood, the endless explanations about finances and care, it all felt like a slow, suffocating death of autonomy. I resisted where I could, refusing to sign documents that would hand over my rights, but I was wearied by the battles, worn thin by the constant pressure. The house itself seemed to grow colder, the rooms echoing with silence where once there had been laughter. The children, caught in the crossfire of adult conflicts, grew distant and unfamiliar. The youngest, once bright-eyed and affectionate, now barely looked at me, as if I were a stranger invading her space. Their behavior mirrored the lessons taught by my daughter and her husband, that I was an outsider, a shadow in their lives. The family gatherings I once cherished became exercises in endurance, filled with awkward silences and strained pleasantries. I sat at the edge, a ghost among the living, watching as the people I loved pretended not to see the pain etched into my face. The tipping point came unexpectedly, on an ordinary afternoon that turned into a moment of reckoning. My daughter's anger, long simmering beneath the surface, erupted in a furious confrontation. "You think you can just threaten us with that video?" she shouted, voice trembling with rage and fear. "You think you can ruin my life and walk away? I won't let you." The accusation stung, not because it was untrue, but because it revealed the depth of her desperation and the power the secret I held had over her. The stolen moments caught on camera had become a weapon in my hands, a force that both terrified and emboldened me. The confrontation was not just about the video, but about the fractured relationship between mother and daughter, about the years of silence and pain finally breaking through. It was a painful, raw exchange filled with recriminations, tears, and bitter truths that had been buried for too long. I stood my ground, refusing to be cowed by her threats or pleas. The fight was no longer just about evidence or justice. It was about reclaiming my voice and asserting my right to be seen and heard. But the cost was high. The days that followed were marked by increased surveillance and control. My daughter's calls were no longer gentle but sharp, demanding to know where I was and who I was speaking to. Friends and neighbors were subtly warned away, and I felt the heavy weight of isolation pressing in once more. The quiet freedom I had begun to taste was slipping through my fingers, replaced by the familiar feeling of being trapped and watched. Yet, amidst the turmoil, I found unexpected allies. A distant cousin, hearing whispers of my struggles, reached out with offers of support and a place to stay if I needed to leave. A local community center welcomed me into its programs, offering a space where I could breathe and connect with others who understood the complexities of family and aging. These connections became lifelines, a reminder that I was not alone and that there was life beyond the walls that sought to confine me. The second escalation tested every part of me, pushing me to the brink of despair and defiance. It forced me to confront the harsh realities of betrayal and control within a family that was supposed to be my sanctuary. But it also revealed the strength that lay hidden beneath the years of pain, a strength forged in the fires of rejection, but tempered by resilience and hope. I began to see that my fight was not just for myself, but for all the women who had been silenced and dismissed, for all the mothers and grandmothers who had been pushed to the margins. The struggle was both deeply personal and painfully universal. As the days grew darker, I resolved to take a step that would change everything. I gathered the evidence, the letters, the photographs, and the memories, and prepared to act in a way that would no longer allow me to be ignored or dismissed. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with risks and unknowns, but I was ready to walk it with my head held high. The second escalation was not the end of my story, but the crucible in which my spirit was tested and tempered. It marked the moment when I chose to stop waiting for change and to become the agent of my own destiny. The pressures and threats that sought to break me only served to ignite the fierce determination that would carry me forward. And so, with a steady hand and a heart fortified by courage, I stepped into the next chapter of my life, one where I reclaimed not only my dignity, but my right to exist on my own terms, free from the chains of silence and control that had bound me for far too long. The day I sent that folder to the pharmacy's HR department was both the hardest and the most liberating moment of my life. I held the envelope in my hands for hours before I finally sealed it, the weight of what I was about to do pressing down on me like a storm cloud ready to break. The folder contained the video stills, the printed copies of the footage that showed my daughter stealing, laughing, careless, oblivious to the camera that had captured her betrayal. I wrote a simple letter to accompany it, with no accusations, no pleas, just the bare facts and an invitation to look. "I thought you should know," I wrote, my hand steady, despite the storm raging inside me. Sending that envelope felt like stepping off a cliff, the abyss of uncertainty yawning below me. I did not know what would come next, anger, retaliation, silence, but I knew I could no longer live in the shadows of their cruelty and deceit. After mailing the package, I began to prepare quietly for what I knew was inevitable: the confrontation, the backlash, the unraveling of the fragile peace I had managed to find in recent weeks. I packed my bags, slowly, methodically, taking only what I needed: a few clothes, my medications, a small photo album of better times. I knew I would not be returning to that house, not as their pawn, not as their forgotten mother. I had somewhere to go. A cousin's daughter in Essex had offered me a room, a fresh start away from the poison of betrayal. Leaving before dawn, I slipped out quietly, the cool morning air wrapping around me like a promise of new beginnings. The journey was long, but every mile carried me further from the shadows I was leaving behind. The flat above the train station welcomed me like a balm to my soul, a sanctuary where I could begin to rebuild the pieces of myself that had been broken and discarded. The days that followed were a mix of relief and fear. relief to be free from the suffocating control of my daughter's household, fear of the unknown, of the uncertain path ahead. But beneath it all was a fierce joy, a reclaiming of my own life, my own narrative that no one could take from me. News eventually reached me that my daughter had been fired from the pharmacy. The HR department acted swiftly once they had seen the evidence. There was no police involvement, no public scandal, just a quiet removal of a woman who had betrayed the trust of her employer and family. When I heard, a cold satisfaction settled in my chest. It was not revenge, but justice, long overdue and deserved. A few weeks later, a letter arrived, cold and sharp, filled with words that stung like knives. "You destroyed my life," it said. "You took everything from me. You are no longer welcome in this family." I read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it aside. Their rejection no longer had power over me. I had traded their false love for truth and dignity. Freedom came with its own loneliness. I was no longer their daughter, their mother, their grandmother. I was simply myself, a woman who had refused to be silenced or diminished. In my small flat, surrounded by the quiet hum of trains and the soft notes of a piano drifting from the apartment below, I began to write a letter, not to them, but to myself, a letter of remembrance and resolve, a declaration that I would never again be a prisoner of neglect or cruelty. I wrote of the pain and the betrayal, but also of the strength and the hope that had carried me through. I wrote that I was proud of the woman I had become, the woman who had found her voice and used it to reclaim her life. The climax of my journey was not a dramatic confrontation or a fiery speech. It was a quiet, powerful act of agency, a refusal to be erased, and a commitment to live fully and authentically. It was the moment I stepped out of the shadows and into the light of my own making. The journey ahead was still uncertain, but I faced it with a heart unburdened by fear or shame. I was no longer defined by the cruelty of others, but by the fierce dignity with which I embraced my own story. And in that embrace, I found peace. In the quiet that followed the storm, I found a new kind of peace, a calm that wasn't born from forgetting or forgiving, but from choosing myself in a world that had long told me I was invisible. The small flat above the train station became more than just a refuge. It became my home, a place where I could breathe and rebuild, piece by piece, the life that had been shattered but never truly lost. The sounds around me, the clatter of trains below, the gentle murmur of neighbors, the distant notes of a piano from the apartment downstairs, wove together into a symphony of normalcy that felt like a balm to my weary soul. The loneliness I had feared softened into solitude, a space I filled with books, quiet walks, and the slow discovery of a self that had been waiting patiently beneath the weight of years and neglect. Letters came, unexpected and tentative. The first was from my grandson, a young man grown into a kind and thoughtful soul who had never quite understood the distance that had grown between us, but who reached out anyway, bridging the silence with simple words of care and curiosity. His letters were a lifeline, a reminder that love can survive even the deepest wounds, that connection need not be severed forever. We met quietly in a small cafe, not rushing to fill the spaces with words, but simply existing together, two souls finding their way back to each other without the heavy burdens of the past. The visit was a gentle reclaiming of family, not through demands or expectations, but through presence and understanding. The house I had left behind remained a distant memory, a place that belonged to another life, one marked by pain and betrayal, but also by the fierce determination that had carried me through. I had learned that letting go was not about giving up, but about freeing myself from chains that no longer served me. In the quiet evenings, wrapped in a worn shawl, I sat by the window, watching the world go by. The seasons changed outside, each one bringing its own lessons of loss and renewal. I baked lemon squares for my neighbor, a woman whose kindness needed no explanation, and shared stories with a small circle of friends I had found in this new chapter. These simple acts became the threads weaving me back into the fabric of life. The phone, once a source of anxiety and pain, remained tucked away most days, a symbol of the distance I had created between myself and the chaos I had left behind. When I did answer, it was on my terms, when I was ready and willing, not because someone demanded it. I found joy in small pleasures, a warm cup of tea, the pages of a well-loved book, the soft hum of music drifting through the evening air. I was no longer waiting for a life to start. I was living the one I had chosen. The woman I had been, the one hidden beneath torn clothes and silenced by neglect, was no more. In her place stood someone older, wiser, and fiercely alive. Someone who had learned that dignity is not given but taken, that strength is born from pain, and that freedom is the greatest gift one can claim. To any woman who hears this story, who feels the weight of invisibility or the sting of betrayal, I say this: you are not alone, and you are never too late to choose yourself. Your worth is not measured by others' acceptance, but by the truth you hold within. The road ahead may be uncertain, and the scars you carry may ache, but within you lies a fire that no one can extinguish. Let it burn bright and let it guide you home to yourself. And when you step out of the shadows, when you reclaim your voice and your life, know that you carry with you the strength of every woman who has walked before you and everyone who will follow. You are enough. You are worthy. You are free. I had thought the threats would be the worst of it. The nursing home, the constant pressure to sign away my rights, the unspoken menace that hung in the air like an approaching storm. But I was wrong. The days after that confrontation with my daughter became a slow, deliberate campaign to wear me down, to make me question my own mind, my own memories, and, most dangerously, my own worth. The cruelty no longer hid in politeness. It moved into the open, wrapped in false smiles and phrases that sounded caring until you heard the edge in them. "You've been so forgetful lately, Mom," she would say, as she took things from my hands, replacing them somewhere out of reach. "You're not as steady as you think," she would add, moving chairs or rugs just slightly so I would stumble, then pointing to my clumsiness as proof of her point. Small, calculated sabotages that left no obvious mark, but that slowly carved away at my confidence. It started with my medications. I kept them in a small box by my bedside, arranged carefully each week so I wouldn't forget a dose. One morning, I found the box gone. I asked my daughter where it was, and she smiled in that tight way that made my stomach turn. "I'm keeping them now," she said, "just to make sure you don't mix them up. You know, for your safety. My safety." The word tasted bitter. I knew what it meant. Control. From that day, I had to ask her each morning for the pills, and sometimes she would forget, making me wait hours until she was ready to give them. I started feeling dizzy, not knowing whether it was my condition or her timing. Food became another tool. At first, she simply stopped asking what I wanted. Then she began serving me smaller portions or setting my plate aside until it was cold. Once, I saw her scraping the last bit of chicken into her husband's plate while mine sat empty. "You don't eat much anyway," she said lightly, as though it were a fact rather than a choice she was imposing on me. I began keeping crackers and fruit in my room, hidden in a drawer like contraband, to keep myself from going hungry on the days when her generosity ran dry. My clothes, those I had left, were moved around or disappeared entirely. I would wake up to find my wardrobe rearranged, my warmer sweaters gone. They were old, she said when I asked. I threw them out. You don't need all that clutter. She replaced them with thinner tops and cardigans that hung awkwardly on my shoulders, as though the goal was not to keep me warm, but to make me look smaller, frailer. I began layering at night just to sleep without shivering. Even my room was not mine anymore. She would enter without knocking, tidying in ways that erased me, moving my books, throwing out letters, replacing my blanket with one she thought was more cheerful. The cheerful blanket was scratchy and smelled faintly of bleach, but the worst part was that it wasn't mine. Piece by piece, she dismantled the little environment I had carved out for myself, leaving me unmoored. The isolation deepened. Phone calls I made to friends went unanswered, and later I learned that she had told them I was too tired or not up for visitors. A neighbor who used to wave at me in the garden now looked away when I passed. My daughter controlled the flow of information like a dam. Nothing came in unless she allowed it, and nothing went out unless she approved. It was like being erased from the world in slow motion. The children watched all this and absorbed the lessons. One afternoon, my granddaughter mimicked her mother's voice, telling me, "You shouldn't be walking alone, Grandma. You're not safe." She said it with a little smile, not maliciously, but as though repeating a line from a play. I felt something inside me crack then, not just from the words, but from the knowledge that my own blood was learning to see me not as a person, but as a fragile object to be managed. The tension between my daughter and me was a constant undercurrent, but she was careful never to explode outright in front of others. Instead, she perfected the art of the quiet threat, statements delivered with a soft voice and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It's really not good for you to be here alone all day. We might have to make some changes," she'd say, her hand resting lightly on my arm. Or, "You're lucky we've kept you here this long. Most families wouldn't." The words were daggers wrapped in silk. I began to feel like I was living under siege. Every day was a calculation. What to say, when to stay silent, how to avoid provoking her. But the more I tried to keep the peace, the more emboldened she became. I could see it in her posture, in the way she began to speak about me to others, as though I weren't in the room. "She's getting worse," she told her friend over coffee one afternoon. "I think we'll have to make a decision soon." I sat in the armchair a few feet away, staring at the carpet, feeling myself being reduced to a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved. And yet, amidst this, the knowledge of what I had, the video, burned quietly in my mind. It was my only weapon, the one piece of truth that could cut through her facade. But I was cautious, too soon, and she might destroy it. Too late, and I might lose my chance. I kept it hidden in a place she would never think to look, a spot so ordinary it became invisible. Each day that passed, I weighed my options, the risk of acting against the certainty of being erased entirely if I did nothing. The breaking point came on a night when the power went out during a storm. We sat in the living room, lit only by candles, the sound of rain against the windows like an insistent drum. My daughter, perhaps emboldened by the darkness, began listing all the reasons I should be grateful. "We feed you, we give you a place to live, we take care of everything," she said. "Most people your age are in care homes. You should be thanking us." I stared at her in the flickering light, the shadows making her face look sharper, harder. Something inside me shifted then, not in anger, but in clarity. I realized that gratitude was not what she wanted. She wanted submission, silence, the slow surrender of my will. And I understood, with a calm that surprised me, that I would never give her that. That night, as the rain poured down and the house slept, I made my plan. It would take timing, and it would take courage, but I would act, not just to save myself, but to make sure that she, for once, would face the consequences of what she had done. From that moment on, I stopped shrinking. I answered her in complete sentences, not just nods. I kept my voice steady when she tried to provoke me. I held her gaze longer than was comfortable for her. These were small rebellions, but I could see the discomfort they caused, and each one brought me closer to the day I would put the envelope in the mail and finally step out from under her shadow for good,